Good afternoon and welcome everyone to the Canadian Nurses Association webinar series, Progress in Practice. This webinar is entitled System Transformation from an Indigenous Perspective. This session is being recorded for nurses who are unable to participate today. Next slide. The information and views in this webinar are presented by non-CNA staff are those of the presenters and not necessarily reflect the original opinion of Canadian Nurses Association. Hi, my name is Ruth Schofield. I am an assistant professor at McMaster University, and I will be hosting this webinar. I am the chair of Community Health Nurses of Canada Leadership Standing Committee, and we've been partnering with CNA for the last several years on this leadership webinar series. One of the purposes of the Standing Committee is to implement a continuing education program on leadership for community health nurses. These webinar series are one strategy in the continuing education program. And we also offer a leadership mentoring program. If you want more information on this leadership mentoring program, please feel free to contact me. At the end of this presentation, we will answer your questions, which you can type in the Q&A box that you see on the right side of the slide. We will address as many questions as we can within the time allowed. The certificate of participation will be emailed to you along with a link to the recording of this webinar. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our presenter, Lisa Pearly Dutcher. Lisa is a Mulsiat Walla'aski woman from Nagokok Tobik First Nations. I apologize, Lisa. I'm sure I have not said that correctly, so bear with me. She's been a registered nurse for 30 years with a master's in nursing from the University of New Brunswick. The focus of her career has been to improve health outcomes for Indigenous people in Canada. Lisa worked as a community health nurse in one of the first communities that transferred health services to a First Nation community in the Atlantic region. She was also at the forefront of the First Nations and Inuit home and community care program when it was launched into First Nations across the country. She established the first Aboriginal Nursing Initiative Director position at the University of New Brunswick Faculty of Nursing. She also worked as the Director of Mental Health Wellness or Mental Wellness for the Atlantic regions, First Nation and Inuit Health Branch. Lisa and her husband, Stephen, are partner consultants providing an online and educational sessions, facilitation and research services on various topics related to Indigenous history and health. She served as president of Indigenous Nurses Association of Canada. Lisa is currently a student studying her Wolastoqey language and is heavily involved in language revitalization. Welcome, Lisa.
Well, Ewan, Ruth, thanks for that introduction. And it is in the trying that I do appreciate trying to say or speak in our language. And that's why, I put it out there because our language hasn't been used or heard by many. And I'm from the Wolastoqey people here in the traditional territory of the Maliseet and the Mi'kmaq people here in what's known as New Brunswick. And we are here on unceded territory. And by saying unceded territory, I mean to say that we have not signed any treaties that relinquish our rights to the land. We've only signed peace and friendship treaties. So before I get started, and I'm also from Nagutgog First Nation. So it takes a while because I mean, a lot of our language, there's a lot of sounds in there that don't exist in the language, in the English language. So I totally appreciate your efforts. And thank you for inviting me to come and to share my experiences with you and our members of the Canadian Nurses Association. I'd like to start out with a little prayer. Because as you said in my bio, I'm in my language journey and I'm taking my Wolastoqey language at the present moment. And I wrote a test today, or a verbal test today. So it's been a day already. And so I want to start it with opening up with a prayer in my language, and I'll also provide the English to that prayer as well. Wuliwin chilp siregeg. Wuliwin chil gizos, klot when a morgan, spidew naga kuli bezogen. Wuliwin chil bus sesamic, chil elot wessel deeted. Wuliwin chil nibau said, kniayot when a morgan. Wuliwin chil gika gonal, klot when a morgan, pison naga midjawagan. Wuliwin chil absieg, jili whipgieg, naga stocknook. Wuli when chil pskikwa, jili wuli mahaskil. Wuli when chil way seasic, back it on ya negmo cheek. Wuli when chil namasic, back it on ya negmo samagwan. Wuli when chil zip seasic, wuli dugadol, delint de waganol. Wuli when chil wajausen, wulam gizi, wulaya mudabin. Wuli when skit gamig, chil psidageg, eli wulaya winuk. Wuli when chil samagwan, modach when gidwismil, middle age. Thank you, Creator, for the sun. It gives us light and keeps us warm. Thank you for the stars, for their twinkling. Thank you for the moon. It gives us light at night. Thank you for the plants that gives us medicine and food. Thank you for the trees, especially the ash trees and the fir trees. Thank you for the grass, especially the sweet grass. Thank you for the animals. They keep the forest clean. Thank you for the fish. They keep the waters clean. Thank you for the birds and their beautiful songs. Thank you for the wind. It makes us breathe clean air. Thank you for the earth, for the good things you have given and done for us. Thank you for the water, so no one will go thirsty. So be it. So I also want to start off by saying that to show gratitude is such an important way of being as an Indigenous person for myself. And it's something that I guess I've grown up to show gratitude for all that I have, for all that we have around us, and for the people around us. And I want to say special acknowledgement to those who have gone before me, those who have kind of helped me to be who I am today. My grandmothers, my grandfathers, my aunties, my uncles, my mother, my father, my siblings, my cousins, my children, my grandchildren, and those who are yet to be born, and those who are yet to come. And to give gratitude for all of that, I think really puts things in perspective each day for me. So my whole career as a nurse is really based on the act of resistance to racism that I experienced as a young mom and as a young person who was helping to care for her grandmother and other members of her family. So a lot of my early days were being a caregiver. And so that really kind of grew me naturally into the profession of nursing. I went into nursing not having real role models, nurse role models like people who looked like me or even shared my experiences as an Indigenous woman. So nursing has always been a good place for me, for my own personal growth, I have found. And it has taught me to really get to the root of a problem and not just to cover it up with a bandage. We learn that in nursing, that we have to clean the wound before we put a bandage on it. And so part of that cleaning out for me personally has been the process of healing for myself. And I've had to go through a lot of healing in my own personal journey. And I'm going to share a little bit of that with you today, because it helps provide context for who I am and for the lessons that I've learned and lessons that I'm going to share with you today. So next slide, please. So here is a picture of me when I was probably about 6 or 7 years old. And I went to a day school in my home community. And it was the first time I experienced institutionalization of education. And I think, you know, part of going to the school also was partnered with going to the Catholic Church in our community as well, because the nuns were the ones who taught us. And, you know, our spirituality was very much kind of being tied into our education by the nuns. So it was complex. This was my first experience with racism and the process of colonization. Although I had no idea what was going on as a child, it was a very confusing time for me as far as my language and my identity. I was strapped for speaking my language. I saw others being strapped for speaking our language. I saw kids being strapped and punished for no good reason other than just being themselves. And maybe, you know, the nuns didn't take a particular liking to them. You know, so basically we were being abused in our own communities. We were being denied our humanity, really, in those schools, I believe, and I've come to learn. And I've been trying to really heal from those early days when I was robbed of my language and my culture. And that's why I think I'm in this language here in the end of my career as a nurse, you know, really seeing that my own need for healing is tied into my reconnecting back with my culture and my language. So that's where I put a lot of my energy right now. And these truths must be told, and before there is reconciliation. And I can really only share my own experiences. But many have also experienced this, as you know, from probably a lot of stories of the residential schools. And many more have suffered greatly, probably more greatly than myself. And I acknowledge that. Some have survived to tell their stories, and many have not survived to tell their stories. So I really feel it's incumbent upon me to share the stories that I have, and so that people can learn from them. Next slide, please. Because really, in the process of transformation, you know, goes to the very core beliefs of who we are as human beings is truth telling. Truth has to be part of how we move in the world. And I think that we all kind of need that basic belief that you know, truth is around us. And so telling of truths is really vitally important to healing. And unfortunately, racism is a difficult conversation to have, but as a society, we are moving more open to, you know, seeing racism and all the hurt that comes from it. So this definition includes a belief of superiority. So a belief of superiority is at the root of racism, really, when you look at this definition. So European superiority implies that there are those who are inferior. And this creates an automatic power imbalance, which fuels bad relationships. Next slide, please. So this is a photo, it's a historical photo, but I think it's important because it really reflects what European settlers, what artists in those days were really wanting to show, like about their society. And these are the explorers of the early days. And this photo is a clear example of the early days of exertion of European superiority over Indigenous peoples. You know, they're assuming the land to be unoccupied, and they're doing this by planting flags and crosses, and you can see they have rifles and other things in that photo to exert their power with coercion, with these weapons. Okay, next slide, please. So we think about Canadian society. I mean, that's the past, we'll say, but you know, it is the past, but it's what the foundation of our society has been built on, is this whole notion of superiority. And so in order to think about, like, how are we going to transform, we have to look at what is the base of our society? Well, how was it built? What keeps it, you know, what supports the good and the bad of our society? And we have to look at that. You know, problems stem from this belief of superiority over others and nature. And out of that stems a lot of individualism, a disconnection from our environment and who we are as a people. Institutionalization of health, education, and spirituality have all been a part of this process, and all leading to a broken relationships and to our collective responsibility, really. So that kind of really sums it up in a very short and way, and how, you know, the past has really helped to shape and define the future, the systems that we currently are part of right now. So yeah, something to think about. Next slide, please. So to kind of further make this point, I wanted to bring up this quote from Duncan Campbell Scott, who was the Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs in 1920. And it really shows the superiority and paternalism into action when he talks about, you know, I want to get rid of the Indian problem. You know, and to me, I always, well, so what is the Indian problem? What is he talking about here? You know, he sees Native people automatically as a problem. So how do you get rid of this problem? And so, you know, one of the areas where they did use to really try to address the Indian problem, and to me, I see that as you know, an attack on our people, to get them off of the land, to institutionalize them, to make them like the Europeans. So next slide, and put them on reserves. So this was that whole process of, you know, residential schools. This is a bunch of students outside of the Shubenacadie Indian Residential School here in Nova Scotia. And so, you know, this is the solution that Duncan Campbell Scott saw as solving the Indian problem, to take away children from their families and to civilize them by putting them into Indian residential schools. There were 135 residential schools in Canada, and these schools went on for approximately 100 years, from 1980 to 1990-ish. Like, but I guess the caveat to that is that in 1990, ban control started happening over residential schools. So the Native people had some control over the residential schools there. So this was the reality of the day. And this was the driving force of policies to oppress and deny Indigenous identity and ways of being by killing the Indian and the child. Some refer to this as a genocide, and some refer to it as a cultural genocide. I won't get into that conversation today, but I'm just putting that out there because there has been lots of discussion about this. Next slide, thanks. So it's well documented really that some of the long-term detrimental impacts of colonization include suppression of our languages, our ceremonies, our cultural ways, and spiritual life. The destruction of family systems, the residential schools were used for that. Creating multi-generational traumas. There's lots to be read on that. There's books out there to verify all of that. Loss of land and relationship to the land. It was also a big loss there for our people. Traditional foods, a big change in our diet occurred as a result. And that's why you see so many health issues within our communities, is that they are not following their traditional diet. They're basically taken on a Western diet. Identity crisis, diminished self-worth is really one of our big issues, I think, today, in terms of, especially, this is being embedded by racism and stereotyping of Indigenous people in the systems and within society. Next slide, please. So, really, if we look at some of the current realities and ongoing impacts, which, I could go, there's lots of stats, and I made it a conscious decision not to get into a lot of the stats. Most of us read the newspapers, we hear that there's many boil water advisories in many communities. People cannot drink their drinking water. I come from a community where we did have that issue as well. I still can't drink my own water in my home, in my community. There's proportionate amount of chronic conditions and diseases. We all know, diabetes and heart disease are the number ones. Premature deaths and increased rates of mortality. We have 10 years less than the average Canadian citizen to live. High rates of addictions and mental health issues and suicide. We have young children as young as 10 years old that are committing suicide. So there's a lot of health issues that have resulted and continue to result from the impacts of colonization within our communities. One that really, and I did put this stat down, is that in 2020, more than 30% of inmates in Canadian prisons are Indigenous people. 5%, which represent basically 5% of the Canadian population. So to me, I saw that stat and I thought, wow, that's really telling of what's going on in our society. When, the smallest population are the highest in the prison system. And some people would say, well, it's their fault. Well, really, we have to examine our beliefs and our thoughts around those types of stats and why are they so high? And ask ourselves those questions and kind of dig deep. We have low rates of Indigenous people working in hospitals. We really don't have those stats of how many Indigenous nurses we have out there still, which is a shame, because I know when I worked at the University of New Brunswick, our rates were going up quite significantly. And yet we still don't have a picture of that within our system. We have no way of capturing that. I know it could be something that the association is still working on, but hopefully that will be something that will be you know, to counteract some of the issues that we're facing within our healthcare system. Next slide, please. Issues like Brian Sinclair, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Brian, who died from neglect in our healthcare system on September the 20th in 2008. He was a 45-year-old man who died of an infection from a blocked catheter, a blood infection, septic shock. He waited for 34 hours in a Winnipeg emergency room without receiving care. Nurses denied even seeing him in the ER, even though a video camera showed that many of them walked right past him. So this really is symptomatic of, in Brian's case, is a clear symptomatic issue of racism within our healthcare system. Next slide, please. So, you know, ignored to death, like, you know, I really, that turn of phrase really spoke to me when I saw that. I thought, yes, that's exactly, you know, the whole system of you know, neglect within our system, and in being denied his full humanity of basic care. This goes against the whole ethic of nursing. And I know, you know, we probably have tons of excuses why this might have happened, but we have to honestly and truthfully look at it and see how we can not make these same mistakes within our watch as nurses. Next slide, please. Again, more recent situations of racism. If you doubt that exists, you know, it's definitely still alive and well in our systems, in our society. Another example was in the case of Joyce Sheshawan in Jolie, Quebec. Sheshawan, there was a video recorded herself over the course of more than 7 minutes, and she can be seen and heard crying out for relief from her severe pain in the hospital bed as nurses charged with caring for her, denigrating her, and with racist and denigrating results. She died shortly afterwards. She left behind 7 children. And, you know, when I saw that video clip on the news, my heart sank so low. I thought, you know, we have to change our systems. We have to do something so that these sorts of things do not happen within our, you know, our hospital systems. Another recent example is that of Sadie North, a 72-year-old elder who entered the Grace Hospital in Winnipeg on Labor Day weekend in 2020. She was suffering from sepsis as well, but instead was accused by 2 ER staff of being drunk. You know, and I've heard this in several local cases of people that I've worked with and communities and community members, family members. It's a common stereotype that you know, nurses play out or healthcare providers play out within our system, and it really needs to come to an end. In all of these cases, you know, Indigenous patients are being labeled as drunks, and you know, they're getting ignored. And in another example that really created a lot of media attention and really broke, you know, my heart, with this young Aboriginal woman, Chantel Moore, was shot dead in her own apartment by an RCMP officer during a wellness check. You know, it really should give us pause to think about, you know, how do we change it so that, you know, Chantel Moore, young women like Chantel Moore who are, you know, who have some issues and need to have mental wellness checks, are, you know, have people who are trained adequately to come in and to address her in the way that she needs to be addressed. We still have a long way to go. In 2016, the College of Physicians of Canada published a fact sheet on dealing the implications of systemic racism on Indigenous people. And it talks about racism serves as a serious barrier to healthcare access that can lead to delayed treatment or a lack of treatment altogether, either of which can have devastating effects on Indigenous people, their families and communities. And as these cases that I just shared with you really illustrate that point. Next slide, please. So I really like this slide because it really kind of gives us that visual impact of how, you know, that whole, our belief systems of equality and you know, how we all have this sense that, you know, we all need to be treated equally. You know, we really must address this issue of racism and stereotypes. We must strive for equity and liberation of those who have been oppressed in our systems. We must see that the approach of treating everyone the same perpetuates Indigenous people's lower health outcomes. Nurses have the opportunity to lead the way. Nursing is a people profession, and we know how to take down barriers. We are resilient leaders who are in positions to make sustainable change. And I really, you know, this like I said, again, I said this slide really, you know, I often found it difficult to explain to somebody, what are we talking about here? You know, why is it that Aboriginal students were getting special seats or this or that? And when this slide, when I saw this slide, I thought this is so perfect because it really shows why, you know, not everybody's starting from the same starting place. And so some people need extra boxes to lift them higher. Some people need more supports. And this really, and there are barriers there sometimes for all of us. So how about we just even try to address all of the barriers that you know, hold us back in terms of having our fullest potential as humans. Next slide, please. You know, these times are really challenging, and I have to say, as anybody else, that, you know, I have found these I guess they call them COVID times, as challenging as anybody else. I have lots of tools in my toolbox. I have lots of things that help keep me grounded. And you know, as a nurse, you know, we have been given this gift of caring, and this is really coming out, you know, as you see, you know, listen to the news, and you know, nurses are heroes. And we start to see that, I mean, that's becoming really evident because I just heard the other day and listening to CBC News that, you know, the applications for nurses has gone significantly up in Canada to come into our profession. So that is absolutely wonderful outcome of these devastating times. So nurses are leading the care revolution. I really believe that. I think this is a time that we are, you know, positioned to really show how our profession can lead the way in terms of making changes and for showing, you know, our belief in a better system, a better way, a humane way. You know, this whole message that we are in this together is also a really nice message that has come out of COVID times, that, you know, we're not excluding people because they're different. We're in this together, you know, if we're not. So, I mean, to me, those messages are really key messages that are coming out of something that is seen as fairly negative. So it's to me, again, looking at the positives of what's happening to us. You know, we have changing roles as nurses. You know, there's technology, there's knowledge, but, you know, are we being empowered by all of that to be better people? It's of no good to us if we're not improving and becoming better people, and we're helping others to be better people. Transformation is happening now. I think COVID's really moved us into and shown us how our systems are failing and falling apart, and we've lost control and lost our balance really within our healthcare system of how we do things. Unfortunately, a lot of people have passed because of the failings of our healthcare system in this difficult time. So it's really exposed our vulnerabilities and our weaknesses. And hopefully that will move us into a new normal. Because really, let's face it, the old normal was not really working for us all. It wasn't working for Indigenous people. It wasn't working for minority people. It wasn't working for anybody. Like, let's make it a better system. This is a new opportunity for change. And, you know, I think that we're very, like I said earlier, we're positioned well to lead this change, transformational change. Next slide. And I've been very privileged to have known some really great people and work with some really great people in my career as a nurse. And many of these nurse leaders that have been leading the way and that I have been, you know, very, like I said, very fortunate, and they've become my mentors, my friends. And people like Carol Prince, an Aboriginal nurse from Manitoba. She speaks about in one of the books that on nurses, Indigenous nurses history, it's talking about how hard as Indigenous nurses we have to work. We have to oftentimes work twice as hard to get to that equal playing field. But in the end, it makes us better. It makes us better nurses. It makes us stronger people. We're more resilient for it. But our ones that are coming up ahead shouldn't have to work that hard. And so the Indigenous Nurses Association of Canada was established in 1975 and was the first professional Indigenous organization in Canada. So many Indigenous nurses leaders that have led the way, like Jean Goodwill, Jocelyn Briere, and the late Dr. Tom Dignan, who just passed away this year, have led, policy changes. They've shifted nursing, in terms of how we look at working with our Indigenous people, as well as how do we do that in a culturally safe, culturally competent way. They've brought those forward. We've worked hard to bring those issues forward. And, people like Madeline Dion Stout, whose picture is there, and Earl Naugizik, Bernice Downey, Claudette Dumont-Smith, Tanya Dick, Julie Lees, Fiola Hart was a geese ago. And these are just a few of the nurses that I've, like I said, been privileged to have known. But we can't do this alone. And I've learned that we have to find like-minded, spirited people who can help make this transformative change that we want in our system. Next slide, please. There's scholars out there like Marie Battiste, who's really putting a lot of literature out there to enlighten us on what does it mean, this transformation, these changes that are required. What is truly sought, she writes, is Indigenous self-determination. This means the active respect of our constitutional Indigenous and treaty rights, the survival and recovery of our languages and knowledge systems, and the growth of our constitutions to serve our current and future needs. But this cannot be achieved in a climate of systemic racism and continual colonial oppression. Therefore, we must decolonize before we can talk about it. So, she really raises some really good issues here. And I think that, this process of, decolonization and addressing systemic racism really need to be addressed in order for us to move forward as a society. Because it really, when a group of people are being marginalized, it doesn't only affect them, it affects those people who are marginalizing them as well. So we can't really reach our full potential as human beings, as nurses, until we address these inequities. You know, we have to, it's part of who we are as caregivers, as people with this knowledge and with this responsibility, really, to create a better place for us to be healthy. Looking at all the determinants of health, not just, you know, things that make us comfortable. So next slide, please. So some examples of self-determination that I have witnessed over the years, and I'm sure there's many more that I'm not stating here, but some of the things that I've seen move over time in my short time here is Indian control of Indian education. I mean, the word, we all know this is what they called it at the time. So the use of Indian is not culturally appropriate now, but they use it in this context because that's how they referred to it in those days. And they can participate within the existing education system in 1970, the health transfer process, which I spoke about earlier, which I was a part of when we first started transferring health processes, health to First Nation communities. You know, I was part of we were part of putting together the first health center in our communities. And this has all been very positive. And now they're talking about devolution of health services to First Nations. I think First Nations want to have more control over their own health, over their own well-being, you know, and I think that will help be part of the solution. You know, we have these Indigenous organizations who are working to try to move us forward into the future and trying to, you know, empower and address some of the power imbalances that exist within our systems. And of course, there's research like the CIHR and all, you know, we need more research. We definitely need, because we know that helps to inform decisions and policy. So definitely we need to continue to move forward in those ways. Next slide, please. Of course, you know, we have, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. We have to readdress the legacy of residential schools. It's just, it's a no-brainer really here. These are something that, you know, as nurses providing care to Indigenous people, you must take it upon yourself to go and learn about the residential schools and the impacts of residential schools. Learn about what the calls to action are. You know, where is they actually, the government has put out on a place, on website called Beyond 94. So it's kind of their report card to where they are in terms of the calls to action. Just Google Beyond 94 calls to action, and you should find it. So, you know, there's definitely, they've kind of been looking at this in a 5-year span, and 10 calls to action have been addressed. 23 are in progress and perhaps underway, and 38 projects proposed and 23 not even started yet. So we've still got a long way to go as far as the TRC's 94 calls to action. That there's particular ones like the health ones, action number 22, 23, and 24, which I'm not going to really go into any detail about, but you know, you should go learn about them. And it talks about, like, 22 is valuing Aboriginal health healing practices and healers in the treatment of Aboriginal patients. 23 is increasing the number of Aboriginal health professionals, retention of Aboriginal healthcare providers, and cultural competency training for all healthcare providers. Number 24 is mandatory courses on Aboriginal health issues for all medical and nursing students. All of the health calls are identified as projects, have been proposed, or projects are underway. So kudos to those who are trying to move this forward. Next slide, please. Some of the ones that I did want to bring to your attention, though, in terms of the calls to action is, basically number 14. Take the time, go in. I mean, you really have to spend some time looking at these if you're in a place and position to make some changes in terms of looking at systems transformation. And this one really gets to the root of, the government to enact an Aboriginal Languages Act and incorporates the following principles. Like talks about language and the importance of language revitalization. To me, this one's near and dear to me because this is what I'm doing right now. So, but this is in progress and there's some projects underway, but still more work to be done here. Next slide, please. And then we have calls to action number 18 and 19, where these are also projects that are proposed. Minister of Indigenous Jane Philpott had committee implementing calls to action number 18, but the federal government has not formally identified or implemented the healthcare rights of Indigenous peoples. Some provinces and territories are making progress. And number 19, we call upon the federal government in consultation with Aboriginal peoples to establish measurable goals to identify and close the gaps in health outcomes. So, it's all work in progress, but I think, we can help move it forward. CNA can help move that forward as well. And then we have the calls to action. Next slide, please. Number 38, which addresses justice. We call upon the federal, provincial, and territorial and Aboriginal governments to commit to eliminating the overrepresentation of Aboriginal youth in custody over the next decade. So that whole statistic, around 30% of Indigenous people within institution, penal system. So, I mean, that really needs to be addressed and looked at. Next slide, please. So really, when it comes down to it, we really need to learn to work together, number one. We need more collaboration, more consultation. And I like this that was written by one of the elders that I have been reading some of her work, and she talks about collaboration. The value of collaboration is tied in the understanding that the well-being of the whole lends itself to the well-being of the individual. So when we're looking at the well-being of the individual, we really have to see that, yes, individualism, but we also have to look at the collective too. And how do we get, we get well by all of us being well and all of us helping one another and all of us helping to ensure justice for all, really. Next slide, please. So in order to change, we must first recognize our place in sustaining a particular ideology, a worldview, a system of oppression. We must also be willing to hear the truth of others who may have been oppressed by that system. Together, find a new normal, a new story, a better way of being. When we transform those around us, we transform systems as well. So really, I love this quote by Gandhi. It says, be the change you wish to see in the world. If you wish to see peace in the world, you need to exude that peace into the world. We all get stressed out. We all have situations that, we're in that may not be ideal, but try to create that peace by being that change you wish to see in the world. And next slide, please. And I want to end by saying, I do this for those who are yet to come, because it's important for us. We have to have a bigger vision than ourselves. We have to have a bigger vision than today. We must do it for those who are yet to come, the seventh generations yet to come. Chiwaliwan, Sinewen.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for sharing your story about your life and also as being a nurse, and really challenging us to really consider change and be leaders in change away from this racism towards decolonization and health equity in our system and creating, as you nicely have said, a new normal. So before we'll go into our Q&A, but before we do that, we have a couple of poll questions that will be asked. If you can complete those, and then we'll move into some questions. And if you can, as you're completing these poll questions, we are beginning to see some questions that have been nicely identified in the Q&A. We do have a little time, not a lot of time, but if you can complete this poll, we'll move into the Q&A. And so as we do that, as you complete that, I'm going to just share, if that's okay, Lisa. There is a question that did come through in the Q&A, whether you've had an opportunity to see that. But just to move forward with the question that has come forward here, if you can see that, what do you hope to see?
What is the question again?
The question is, what do you hope to see in RN and NPs of settler descent in their everyday practice that promote health equity among Indigenous populations?
What do I hope to see? Well, I think that, you know, we have to start right at, like, again, like my whole presentation was on, we need to address racism, stereotypes. So as nurses, we need to re-examine what our belief system is. That requires some active, you know, work on your own behalf. You know, how am I treating people? How am I contributing to dysfunction within wherever I'm working? Am I helping to move things along in a good way, or am I being a barrier? And how can I change to become more of a change agent and somebody who can work and facilitate people in a good way? So I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah, there's so much we can do by just getting ourselves into a good frame. But basic, that's where we need to start. I mean, if you definitely are not knowledgeable about Indigenous issues, not knowledgeable about cultural competency, cultural safety, you need to get on board with that, number one. And you know, as part as being like a ally for Indigenous people, you need that as your basis, like, because it's hard to know your place when you're kind of working as an ally. And sometimes that can be challenging waters for people. But I think if you come from a sincere desire and a place to learn and to grow and to make changes, then, you know, people are open to helping you along in that journey.
Thanks, Lisa. And there's been another one that has been put on here as well. How can we promote Indigenous persons to take health professional courses in PSW, RPN or LPN, RN, NP? How can you see that can be promoted within Indigenous people?
Well, I mean, number one, I think we need to have some role models, and we need to highlight those role models. I think that, you know, like from this experience of COVID, I think it's really challenged all of us to raise the bar in terms of our caring index. And, you know, how are we helping our neighbors out? How are we doing something to help the other? You know what I mean? And I think these times are really calling us to task on that. And those who are naturally driven into those professions like PSWs, nursing, what have you, I think, you know, by being a good role model, I never talked about my experience. And the reason why I went into nursing was because of the racism that I saw around me. Unfortunately, that motivated me, because I thought, you know what? For some reason, I saw that I could make a difference. I could make things better. I could be, I could be a better nurse than those nurses were to my grandmother. So that motivated me. So I'm not promoting racism to say that would motivate, but I'm just saying that, you know, you need if I would have had more healthier role models, I think that probably would have motivated me as well. But I didn't see any nurse role models around me. And so unfortunately, it was the negative that motivated me. But thank goodness I had the internal wisdom to see that I could do that and could accomplish it. But I think just encouraging people and maybe seeing those who kind of have the natural ability to, you know, have that gift of sharing is really important, to motivate them, support them. Having the right supports available too, I think is critical, because, you know, if they don't have the right supports, if their language is not English, it's not their first language, then that can be a huge barrier. Finances can be a huge barrier. Remoteness can be a huge barrier. So there's lots of things that are barriers that still exist for people to get into our profession, and people to come into, you know, this realm of caring in our profession.
Thanks, Lisa. We have had several responses in the chat as well as in our Q&A, and I appreciate, we'd love to respond to all of them, but we need to respect that this is a time period that people have given us till 1 o'clock. So perhaps, do you think we can possibly do one more question and then we can go into the end? There are a few things we need to cover. If you don't feel you could do justice to some of these questions, I think what I can say to the audience is, though we couldn't do it, all these questions, whatever's been come up in the chat, will be saved, plus whatever in the Q&A, and we can follow up with each you or Lisa can, and give you a response, just because all these questions are critical, but our time is, in all fairness, has gone. So I think I do need to go on, because I do know that we do need to finish and respect the time of each of us. So again, thank you so much, Lisa. You have really, as you can see the responses, this has really touched the hearts of many, and the wisdom that you have shared with us, and challenges for us all. So thank you, and we hope that it certainly has stimulated system transformation and ways that we as nurses can move this forward, both as Indigenous and non-Indigenous nursing leaders.
I think sometimes that, you know, we may see system transformation so big out there, something that, you know, somebody out there is going to take care of it. But it really starts, systems are created by humans. You know, our nature has its own system, which we fit perfectly into. But we create these other systems that oppress, that either serve us well or do not serve us well. And so we have to decide, do the new systems going forward, how do they help to serve us as human beings? And if they're not serving all of us well, then we need to change them. And only we can do that. Yeah. So we have our own little parts to play in our own little stories, our own little scenarios in life. But everybody, just do your part. And that's all that's required of us. We are all here for a reason. You are where you are supposed to be for a reason. Mm-hmm. Do your part and be the change.
Thanks, Lisa. That's incredible. So I think, as I mentioned at the very beginning, you will have access to this webinar. It is recorded at the YouTube channel on CNA. So make sure that you look for it and use it as you can. And if you haven't already, please consider registering for next webinars. They are ongoing, and there is one planned for workplace mental health, leave of absence and return to work experience, preliminary findings from the Healthy Professional Workers Partnership, which will be held on March 23rd. Again, the same time period. So thank you once again, both Lisa and all of you who have joined us. We have our challenge ahead together. I love the collaboration. Thanks, Lisa. It's been incredible. Bye,
Thanks all. All you wonderful nurses out there. I know you're all doing your best.
Thank you. Bye now.
Bye.